The transatlantic slave trade stands out due to its massive scale and enduring impact on African, European, and American societies. But what's often overlooked is the active role played by some African empires and leaders. Slavery was there in many African societies long before European traders arrived. From ancient Egypt to the powerful cities of Carthage and Axum, the practice of enslaving people was established and normalized, though it varied significantly across regions and societies. Enslaved individuals might be prisoners of war, victims of raids, or born into servitude, and their labor was often critical for economic production, infrastructure projects, or expanding a ruler's military power. Much of Africa's early slave trade was directed towards the Middle East and North Africa through the trans-Saharan routes. Known as the trans-Saharan slave trade, it moved hundreds of thousands of enslaved Africans northward to the Islamic world, and some even reached the Indian Ocean trade network. African, Arab, and Berber traders played critical roles in these networks, exchanging enslaved people for goods like spices, textiles, and weapons. This trade was a precursor to the Atlantic slave trade, with a system already in place that later facilitated the Atlantic routes. In West Africa, the Ghana Empire, which flourished from the 3rd to the 13th centuries, provides an early example of a society that capitalized on enslaved labor for economic gain. Positioned strategically between desert and forest, Ghana controlled vital trade routes across the Sahara, trading gold, salt, and slaves to North Africa and the Middle East. Enslaved individuals were crucial for the empire's economy, as they worked on farms, in salt mines, and as porters on arduous desert trade routes. By controlling trade routes and ensuring a steady labor force, Ghana's leaders strengthened their empire's wealth and influence across the region. The Mali Empire, which rose after Ghana, reached its height under Mansa Musa in the 14th century. Known for his legendary wealth, Mansa Musa's empire relied heavily on enslaved labor to extract and process gold and salt, two of the empire's most valuable resources. Slavery under Mansa Musa and later rulers served not only economic, but also social functions. Enslaved people worked alongside free citizens in agriculture, mining, and construction. Some also served in military roles, and a few rose to positions of influence within the empire's court. For the ruling class, the institution of slavery wasn't just a means of labor, but a way to maintain wealth, strengthen social hierarchies, and expand their influence. Following Mali, the Songhai Empire expanded and refined these systems further. The Songhai leaders not only continued the use of enslaved labor, but also expanded their territories with armies that included enslaved soldiers, many of whom were captives from conquered regions. The Songhai elite recognized the value of enslaved people for expanding agricultural production and bolstering the empire's military strength. Enslaved workers helped develop large farms and provide food for urban centers, supporting the empire's growth. This reliance on enslaved labor in farming, mining, and the military highlighted slavery's deep roots and extensive role in African empires' rise to power. Across these empires, slavery was an institution with many faces. Enslaved individuals might find themselves working in grueling conditions in gold and salt mines, or serving as soldiers or advisors, depending on the needs of the ruling class. Treatment varied widely. In some societies, enslaved people had certain rights or opportunities for manumission, while in others, they lived in harsh conditions with little hope of freedom. Regardless, the institution of slavery remained a cornerstone of political and economic life across Africa, adapting to the needs and structures of successive empires. So, by the time European traders began arriving on Africa's coasts, they encountered societies already familiar with slavery's mechanisms and hierarchies. This existing system, with its economic and social complexities, played a pivotal role in shaping African responses to the Atlantic slave trade, laying the groundwork for the interactions that would profoundly impact African, European, and American societies for centuries to come. The Atlantic slave trade began in the mid-15th century when Portuguese explorers reached Africa's western coast. What they found surprised them: a vast, pre-existing network of trade routes and economic systems that included the sale of enslaved people. At first, Portuguese traders primarily brought enslaved Africans to Europe, where they served in various domestic and agricultural roles. However, as European powers began establishing colonies in the Americas, demand for enslaved laborers skyrocketed. Europeans quickly recognized that these established African systems of capturing, enslaving, and trading people could supply the labor they needed in the New World. One of the biggest misconceptions about the Atlantic slave trade is that Europeans alone captured and enslaved Africans. In reality, European traders rarely entered the interior of the continent. Instead, they relied on African leaders, merchants, and powerful warlords who sold captives acquired from wars, raids, and intertribal conflicts. These captives were then sold at coastal ports to European traders, creating a transaction that involved negotiation, agreement, and in many cases alliances. In exchange, Africans received goods such as textiles, metalwork, alcohol, and most notably firearms. This exchange of goods intensified existing rivalries as groups that obtained firearms gained a powerful advantage, leading to further conflicts, raids, and enslavement. The introduction of European firearms radically transformed African politics and warfare. Rival states and kingdoms competed fiercely to acquire firearms, which allowed them to defend themselves or launch aggressive campaigns against neighboring groups. This, in turn, increased the demand for captives, as more slaves meant more trade with Europeans, which meant more firearms. Over time, this vicious cycle destabilized many regions as African leaders and elites sought to maintain or expand their powers through slave raiding and warfare. What began as sporadic interactions soon evolved into systematic efforts to capture and sell people, drawing more and more African communities into the orbit of the Atlantic trade. The Congo Kingdom provides a powerful example of these complex relationships. The kingdom had long been an established and influential state in Central Africa, and by the late 15th century it had formed a strong alliance with Portugal. King Alfonso I, an early Congo ruler, embraced Christianity and sought to modernize his kingdom. Eager to gain Portuguese support, he allowed the Portuguese access to the slave trade on his kingdom's terms. King Alfonso I tried to regulate the flow of enslaved people, distinguishing between captives from wars and those who were free subjects of the Congo. However, as demand grew, he struggled to maintain control, often writing letters to the Portuguese monarchy, pleading for fairer trade practices and urging them to limit the enslavement of his own people. The alliance with Portugal offered benefits in wealth and political power, but also introduced instability and hardship within the kingdom as the trade spiraled beyond the king's control. Further east along the West African coast, the Akan peoples of what is now modern-day Ghana also played a central role in the Atlantic slave trade. The Akan regions, rich in gold, had been engaged in extensive trade long before European contact. With the arrival of Portuguese, Dutch, and British traders, the Akan established a robust trade network centered around both gold and enslaved labor. The Akan used enslaved labor extensively in their gold mines, which were some of the richest in the world. To maintain a steady supply of labor, they engaged in local conflicts and raids to capture people, who were then forced into the mines or sold to European traders. The Akan became vital intermediaries, trading both gold and enslaved captives to the Europeans and exchanging these goods with both African and European merchants. This profitable arrangement allowed them to maintain significant political and economic power, while also intensifying their role in the trade network. The African response to the Atlantic slave trade was far from uniform. While some leaders and empires actively participated, others grappled with the moral, political, and societal implications of the trade. Not every African kingdom, community, or ruler embraced the Atlantic slave trade without reservations or resistance. Along Africa's western coast, some groups took drastic measures to protect their people from being captured and sold. Small coastal communities, in particular, sometimes resorted to attacking European slave ships, hoping to repel the foreign traders who threatened their populations. However, these efforts often faced significant challenges. European ships were heavily armed, and the traders had the support of well-armed African intermediaries who supplied captives to the Europeans. While these acts of resistance underscored a determination to protect their people, the limited resources and power of many of these communities made it difficult to sustain large-scale resistance. The presence of firearms, gifted or traded by Europeans, also made rival groups formidable allies to the Europeans. This internal division weakened unified resistance and further complicated the responses to the African slave trade. The Kingdom of Benin, one of West Africa's most sophisticated and powerful states, offers a compelling example of selective involvement in the Atlantic slave trade. Initially, Benin participated in the trade, exchanging captives for European goods, including firearms. However, as the trade grew, Benin's leaders began to recognize the negative impact it was having on their population. In the 16th century, the Oba, or King of Benin, restricted the kingdom's involvement in the slave trade, limiting exports of enslaved individuals to protect the population from severe decline. This choice was both a strategic and ethical one. The kingdom needed its people to maintain its strength and stability, especially in the face of potential threats from neighboring states. By restricting slave exports, the Oba ensured Benin could retain a strong population and workforce within its own territory, focusing instead on trading other goods, like ivory and pepper. Despite this selective withdrawal from the Atlantic trade, Benin continued to uphold domestic slavery within its borders, reflecting the kingdom's complex and nuanced stance. For Benin, abolishing slavery altogether was never an option. Domestic slavery played a central role in its social and economic structures, where enslaved individuals could serve in households, on farms, or as artisans. The kingdom's stance was, therefore, not a wholesale rejection of slavery, but a careful negotiation of the ways it would participate in the Atlantic system. When the British launched anti-slavery pressures in the 19th century, Benin resisted, preferring to maintain its sovereignty and uphold its internal customs rather than succumb to foreign influence. The Kingdom of Dahomey, located in what is now Benin, was one of the most prominent African states involved in the Atlantic slave trade. Founded in the early 17th century, Dahomey grew rapidly, fueled by the wealth and resources generated through the trade of enslaved people. Under the leadership of powerful kings like Agaja and Gizo, Dahomey's rulers constructed a society deeply intertwined with the slave trade, making it a cornerstone of the kingdom's economy and military strength. In the early 18th century, King Agaja led Dahomey in a series of aggressive expansions that greatly increased the kingdom's involvement in the slave trade. Agaja's military campaigns targeted neighboring regions, capturing people who would become a source of enslaved labor both for Dahomey's own needs and for sale to European traders. His conquests brought strategically important ports like Alada and Wida under Dahomey's control, allowing the kingdom to dominate the coastal trade and negotiate directly with European powers. By seizing these ports, Dahomey became a central hub for the Atlantic slave trade, with thousands of captives flowing through its markets each year. Through this control over trade routes and ports, Dahomey's economy grew heavily reliant on the Atlantic slave trade. The kingdom's leaders forged direct relationships with European traders, ensuring a steady flow of European goods, including weapons, alcohol, and textiles. These goods helped maintain Dahomey's military dominance, creating a cycle in which raids generated captives were traded for European goods, and those goods further empowered the kingdom's military capabilities. Dahomey was unique for its highly organized and well-equipped standing army, which included a fierce group of women warriors known as the Amazons by European observers. Maintaining this large military force required extensive resources, especially a labor force of enslaved people, to produce food, build infrastructure, and support the kingdom's growing demands. Enslaved individuals in Dahomey not only worked in agriculture and construction, but also supported the kingdom's artisans and craftsmen. Some were even used as soldiers, furthering Dahomey's reach in regional conflicts and slave raids. Raiding for captives became a primary method of expanding Dahomey's influence and wealth. Many of those captured in these raids were either sold to European traders or integrated into Dahomey's labor force. However, not all captives were destined for labor. Some were kept for ritualistic purposes. The kingdom's religious practices included the sacrifice of captives during ceremonies and festivals, especially the annual customs ceremony, where enslaved individuals were offered in tribute to honor Dahomey's deities and ancestors. By the early 19th century, European anti-slavery campaigns were gaining momentum. The British forces sought to pressure African kingdoms, including Dahomey, to abandon the slave trade. But King Gizo, one of Dahomey's most powerful rulers, resisted these calls. Under Gizo's rule, the slave trade accounted for the majority of Dahomey's wealth, and he believed ending the trade would leave the kingdom vulnerable and economically weakened. When the British offered Gizo financial compensation to end the trade, he refused, famously stating that, "The slave trade is the ruling principle of my people." As British pressure against the slave trade intensified, Dahomey found an opportunity to pivot towards a new European ally, France. Unlike the British, who were adamantly anti-slavery, the French were more willing to maintain a complex relationship with Dahomey for its own imperial interests. Gizo saw this as a chance to continue participating in trade while sidestepping British interference. However, as European powers increasingly looked to control African territories outright, Dahomey's independence and reliance on the slave trade ultimately contributed to its vulnerability to colonization. By the early 19th century, the landscape of global politics and economics was changing. The same European powers that once profited immensely from the transatlantic slave trade began to position themselves as champions of abolition. At first glance, it might appear as though moral and humanitarian concerns had sparked this transformation. However, the shift was driven as much by economic and political interests as by ideals, with anti-slavery campaigns often serving as a convenient justification for colonial ambitions. The Industrial Revolution changed the economic priorities of European powers. With new machines, factories, and efficient labor models, European industries no longer relied on enslaved labor to fuel their economies. Britain, the leading global power, became the first to outlaw the transatlantic slave trade in 1807, and by 1833, it had abolished slavery across its empire. Many historians note that the shift away from slavery was economically advantageous for Britain, as they turned to cheaper industrial forms of labor while other nations still relied on outdated slave economies. As Britain took the lead in anti-slavery efforts, it began to pressure other European nations and African states to follow suit. British abolitionist groups campaigned to end the slave trade worldwide, seeing it as both a moral duty and a way to weaken competing colonial powers who still used enslaved labor. For European powers, anti-slavery became a powerful tool for expanding influence in Africa. Under the guise of eradicating the slave trade, they increasingly involved themselves in African political and economic affairs. Abolition allowed European powers to frame their colonial ambitions as a mission to civilize and liberate African societies, when in reality, this agenda often meant seizing control of African resources, restructuring societies for European gain, and establishing political dominance. The British intervention in Lagos illustrates this complex dynamic. Lagos, a thriving coastal port, was an active center of the slave trade in the early 19th century. British officials argued that taking control of Lagos would allow them to dismantle its slave markets and curb slave raiding along the coast. In 1851, Britain attacked Lagos under the pretext of eradicating the slave trade, ultimately deposing the Oba, who resisted British influence. In 1861, Lagos was annexed as a British colony, officially ending its role in the slave trade. However, this liberation came with a steep price. Lagos was now under British rule, and its people had little say in their governance. The European campaign to end slavery in Africa left a complex legacy. On one hand, it contributed to the eventual abolition of the transatlantic slave trade and the reduction of human trafficking. On the other hand, the anti-slavery movement became a pretext for the aggressive colonization of African societies. For many African regions, European liberation brought a new form of subjugation, as colonial administrators imposed their own laws, cultures, and economic priorities. Rather than supporting genuine freedom, the anti-slavery campaign often marked the beginning of a new era of exploitation. The history of Africa's role in the slave trade is one of both victimhood and agency. While countless Africans endured horrific suffering as slaves, African empires and leaders also played a role in perpetuating this institution. Recognizing this complex reality allows us to see African societies not as mere victims, but as actors within a global system of exploitation that eventually paved the way for abolition movements worldwide.